Now let's move on to our next live conversation. And this one is on the world post-COVID and how it's impacted on demographics. This is going to be an exciting session, and we've got some heavyweight guests on. Joining us from Denver, Colorado, we welcome Denny Fish, who is Portfolio Manager for Global Tech and Innovation, Andy Acker, Portfolio Manager for Global Life Sciences and Biotech, as well as Greg Kuhl, who looks after Global Property Equities. Jess Leoncini, our Global Head of Product Management and Marketing, will host this session. Jess, over to you, and thank you for doing this.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks everyone for dialing in. I'm thrilled today to be joined by Denny, Greg, and Andy to dive into really these trends that Sarah introduced from more of that sector level. So since we're going to be talking about the world post-COVID, Andy, I think it makes sense to start with backing up to the vaccine and the development of the vaccine, which happened in record-breaking time. Typically, the development of vaccines take a decade, sometimes even longer. But we saw this vaccine come very effective within a year. Is this indicative of the innovation you're seeing within your sector, or do you think this was more of a one-off?
Well, sure, I think it is, and hopefully you can see me. I'm not sure if everyone can see me and hear me, but I think it is indicative of what's happening in the sector. And as you mentioned, the advances against COVID were really amazing in terms of getting new vaccines so quickly. But it's really just one sign of what's happening in the space. And we're seeing this incredible acceleration of innovation with more new therapies coming to market than we've ever seen before. In fact, just over the last 5 years, we've had almost 250 new medicines approved in the United States, which is up about 100% from where we were just 10 to 15 years ago. This year, in fact, we could have over 80 new therapies approved, which would be a new record. And many of these are really highly innovative therapies. And just to give you a couple of examples, we recently, just in the last few months, had the first approval of a therapy that clearly improves outcomes for patients with Alzheimer's disease. That was a huge breakthrough. We have new therapies for obesity that can lead to 15 to 20% weight loss, previously only achievable with bariatric surgery. And then recently we had approvals for dry AMD, one of the leading causes of blindness in the elderly. And potentially even this week, we could have the first gene therapy approved for the treatment of muscular dystrophy, another devastating genetic disease. So really, I think what happened with COVID is just one small example of what we're seeing with acceleration of new therapies addressing high unmet medical needs in the biotechnology space.
So truly life-changing technology is happening within biopharma, and Andy. Greg, shifting over to you, thinking of this post-COVID environment we're in, this has certainly had an impact on the property sectors that you follow. What are some of the demographic trends and some of the things that you're seeing shaping the needs and the usage within the property sector?
Yeah, it's certainly an important question, and it is one of the areas, I think that reacted in the markets and in the fundamentals in a pretty material way to COVID and post-COVID. Our comment would be that a lot of the things that we saw with the virus were really just acceleration of trends that were kind of already happening. A lot of those were demographic related. There's four key things I'd highlight, and just kind of going through each of them in turn. The first one is e-commerce growth, right? And this is partly demographic, partly just a preference, but you saw the penetration of e-commerce spike during COVID in terms of percentage of total sales. It came back down then post the virus, and now it's come right back, and we're actually almost back to that super high point, 16.5% of sales that we were at in the second quarter of 2020, when no one could even go to stores. We're almost back to that point today. So that's driven record demand for warehouse space. And it's also, we think permanently impaired demand for some outdated retail concepts, like enclosed malls, where you see mostly apparel and discretionary retail. Very solidly in the demographic camp is another trend that I would call kind of demographic-driven housing preferences. And there's a couple of key categories within that. The first one I'll highlight is millennials moving into single-family housing. You saw that pick up quite a bit during the pandemic, and I think what happened there is there was a pull forward of what would have already happened anyway. People who might have thought about moving to suburbs and single-family homes did so potentially earlier. That was really good for single-family rental landlords that we invest in. It was also, a big tailwind for home builders, and then a little bit less good for urban apartments. We have not seen those trends slow down, so it did maybe pull some of it forward, but that has continued kind of post-COVID, and we think that trend is solidly in place. The other side of it is baby boomers who are aging into their assisted living type of years, which tends to be over 80. So we're just getting there now. I'd say, COVID disrupted demand for assisted living very significantly. If you remember, during the pandemic, there was restrictions on visitation. So if your parent was in one of those facilities, you weren't able to visit them. I think the logical output of that was people delayed moving in there as much as possible because nobody wanted that situation. Now that we're past that, we're seeing the occupancy in those type of facilities ramp back up. At the same time, we are finally at the point where that big demographic segment of the population is getting very close to the 80 plus age range. So that means a lot of demand for assisted living. And then at the same time, the pandemic, what it ended up doing is really put a stop to development of assisted living and all types of real estate. And then we've seen, credit market issues more recently that have continued that. So less supply and rapidly growing demand in that segment of kind of the demographic-driven, housing area. That's really good for the companies that we look at. And then just a couple more. I mean, technology. We have Denny, so I'm not going to say too much about it. But from a demand perspective, very clearly, we've seen some of these trends around housing, disparate locations of people working, driving demand for connectivity and centralized computing, which in our world in property is data centers and cell towers. So that demand picked up during the pandemic. That's continued, and we haven't really seen much of any of a give back post-COVID. Those trends are just getting stronger in our view. And then the last trend I won't touch on for too much, but it's office, right? We've seen a big change in office post-pandemic. And again, I would say that's something was in place already and it's accelerated. For most of the 2000s, office landlords have been dealing with a headwind of occupiers becoming more efficient with space. So that means less space per person, as we've probably all experienced throughout our careers. Most people don't sit in offices now. You have a lot more, people per square foot. So that I thought had largely played out leading up to the pandemic. Now we have this thing called hybrid work that's basically the same phenomenon by a different name. And it means that, I think there's less demand for office space structurally going forward. And we're going to see that play out over many years. I think one stat that's helpful to think about here is office attendance, which is tracked by a variety of different sources. And on a weekly basis, a weekly average attendance in the US has topped out at about 50% of pre-COVID levels. There's actually a big story in the journal today about that, to that effect. Outside of the US, attendance is much better. You're upwards of 80 in some of the other big cities around the world in Europe and Asia, but we seem to be stuck at about 50% here in the US. One important exception to that, since we have Andy here as well, is lab space, so research and development space, which gets lumped in with office in the public REIT world. That's a completely different animal. Those assets are doing pretty well. The fundamentals are healthy. Andy talked about the drug approval regime that is so much better and faster now than it was in the earlier part of the 2000s. And that's actually a really important demand driver for that small pocket of office.
So demographics are truly impacting every segment of the population and a lot of these subsectors within your space, Greg. Denny, I'd love to dive into the hybrid working space a little bit more and how the technology sector is really helping to enable that. We need a lot more different tools and innovation to be able to facilitate that hybrid working environment. What are you seeing within your sector?
Yeah, well, I think these were trends that were slowly developing prior to the pandemic. And then obviously we had a force function that caused everyone in the world to have to adopt some sort of communication or, access, technologies to actually keep the global economy running. And and so sometimes you have something like that. It takes something that's been really slow moving and it kicks it into the lower end of the S curve, and then suddenly you have just massive adoption. And I think what's really important about that is that we have structurally become a lot more efficient because of the pandemic. And there are certain roles that are physical by nature, and whether that's certain elements of manufacturing or warehousing or things, but then in the knowledge worker economy, I think we were really inefficient around the amount that companies spend on travel or what it felt like obligations to be in certain places at certain times, and the pandemic just structurally changed that because we were actually able to get a lot more efficient. And importantly, is the technology change over the last 15 years actually has enabled that. So if the pandemic would have hit in 2005, for example, it would not have been nearly as smooth as it was. The protocols for communication, the primary ways that you could communicate remotely were audio or pretty remedial things like WebEx. The cloud infrastructure hadn't been built out yet. There were so many things that just would not have enabled us to operate the way that we were able to operate during the pandemic. And fortunately, we had laid all that groundwork ahead of what happened. And so now I think we've just become a lot more efficient. And we might talk a little bit about this later, but then you also layer on AI and what we can do there in terms of different modalities and transcription and call feedback and things like that. We're just gonna now stack upon what we've learned the last 3 years and take productivity to an entirely different level across collaboration and communication. So.
Okay, and shifting gears a little bit, Denny, thinking of the COVID lockdowns that we saw, especially impacting areas like China, which you can call the manufacturing hub, thinking of that and the impact of some of the vulnerabilities that we saw in supply chains, especially those concentrated supply chains, pairing that with some of the geopolitical factors we're seeing. What do you think the impact of that is? Do you see this as an opportunity going forward? Is this a headwind within your sector?
No, it's clearly an opportunity. And I mean, if anything, the pandemic just really exposed those holes or gaps that could occur in the global economy because of the concentration of supply chains. And so I think there are a couple things going on there. One is that we need to make supply, we have fundamentally now started the move from just in time, which was pretty much a 40-year journey, to just in case. And that has real implications. We are diversifying supply chains globally, meaning, we're going to move, much of our manufacturing out of China, both just because we need the resiliency of the supply chains, and then you also have the geopolitical tension between the Western world and China. And then I think the sector that maybe got the most exposure, that is one of the most important sectors, I always say semiconductors are the new oil, but they've been the new oil for like 30 years. But the pandemic actually enlightened everybody in the world to the importance of semiconductors, and everything shut down. autos, medical equipment. Like, I mean, you can just go down the list. Nobody could ship product because they couldn't get semiconductor content. And in some cases, these were golden screw products that cost like 10 cents. And so we have structurally moved to an environment where investors are much more aware at how great those businesses are, how important they are to the global economy, and every domestic government worldwide has decided that they need some sort of control over semiconductor output to be able to, sustain their local economies. And so now we're in a period where we are seeing a significant mix of semiconductor fabs being built outside of Taiwan and Korea, and in the US, in Japan, in Europe, now in India. And that's a decade-long trend that's going to continue. And the importance of semiconductors, is now as forefront in the mind of investors as they ever have been. And that's really good.
You probably never expected semiconductors to become a topic of dinner conversation amongst people that typically don't have much knowledge in that space. But I think that was
that's right.
Greg, I have to imagine this impacts the property sector as well. Do you also see opportunities as Denny outlined, or are there different considerations you're thinking within your sector?
Yeah, we think it's also a tailwind. So, and the real place where we're going to see it is in industrial logistics warehouses. So, Denny said it, on just in time is turned into just in case. So there's an obvious implication of that, which is if you're going to have a safety stock of inventory, you need somewhere to put it. And so that means more demand for warehouse space. You're going to have a structurally higher level of inventory going forward. We've started to see that happening. And then the other point is really, reshoring or nearshoring away from China and into other markets. And I think that's also an opportunity, especially on the listed property side, because China is kind of the one part of the world where it's really difficult or impossible to get exposure to warehouses, but we have that elsewhere throughout the world. So that's also an opportunity for us driving demand. And then both of those are in addition to what I think is still a really strong tailwind in terms of this e-commerce proliferation, where there's a lot of retailers that are not named Amazon that have to build out their capabilities to deliver you a product in 2 days. And to be able to do that takes a lot of physical infrastructure in terms of distribution centers, last mile fulfillment centers, and the like. And we all know about Amazon, but there's every other retailer that's pretty far behind them. So there's a lot of tailwinds there in our space. The supply chain is a new one, relatively speaking.
Absolutely. Okay, shifting gears a little bit, Denny, a topic I'm really excited to get into is AI and the proliferation we've seen recently. So Andy talked a little bit about how healthcare is starting to change lives. What about AI? How is that going to start to change lives?
Yeah, I mean, there is a view, and I subscribe to this view that we might be on the cusp of the biggest productivity boom that we've seen in the global economy since the Industrial Revolution. And it really is this combination of factors that have all come together to enable AI to proliferate in a meaningful way. I mean, AI has been around for 30 or 40 years, but we've never had access to an infinite levels of compute or GPUs like we have today, or the cloud platforms, and then just the amount of investment that's actually going in to these large language models that we've seen, and the advancement that we've seen over the last year relative to seriously the last 20 to 30 years. And so if we think about that, we could spend an hour talking about it, but the productivity enhancements just through many, many sectors of the economy, whether it's, remedial, elements of accounting or paralegal, or what I call kind of the bottom rung of white collar jobs. There's just going to be a lot of that we're going to be able to automate. We're going to be able to get a lot more efficient in terms of drug discovery, in terms of, Andy's, space, which, we've been on this journey for, the last 30 years. And he talked about earlier, we're just going to be able to completely, flip on its head the relationship between technology and labor in areas like customer support and service, where 90% of all expenditures are actually on labor, in call centers, and supporting customers, versus 10% in technology infrastructure. And, we're about to massively overhaul that because of AI. So, I couldn't be more excited about the prospects of AI and the potential for, real productivity gains, which we've been lacking, for the last many years in the global economy. And, we have the potential to really bend that curve.
So exciting pace of change happening in your sector. Andy, what about pace of change in your sector? We saw Pfizer recently announced that it will acquire Seagen, a big cancer drug maker, for $43 billion, which is the largest in M&A we've seen since 2019. Do you expect to see more of this? And how is this impacting the trends that you're watching?
Yeah, so I would say we have definitely been expecting an acceleration of M&A, and really driven by two different factors. First of all, on the side of the buyers, the major pharmaceutical companies are actually facing substantial patent expirations by the end of this decade. In fact, Pfizer even said publicly that they need to replace $25 billion of revenue, risk-adjusted revenue, by 2030. And Pfizer has obviously been very active. Other companies have been active as well. In fact, just through early May this year, we've had almost $70 billion of deals announced in the biopharma space, which is similar to all of last year. So we were seeing a pickup, but we have had a little bit of a pullback now because the FTC is actually challenging one of these acquisitions, which is the acquisition of Amgen trying to buy Horizon for about $28 billion. So that, I think, has created a little bit of hesitation right now, at least for larger deals, those that are over $15 billion. Now, it's interesting because this case is really going to set new precedent, because typically the FTC would only try to block a deal where there was significant overlap. And in this case, there's not really that much overlap between the two companies. And so the FTC is using a new theory, essentially based on what Amgen might do, which we think of as kind of like giving someone a ticket when they're pulling out of their driveway because they might speed. So we've never seen this before. The consultants we talk to think it's a little bit of a long shot that this will actually be blocked, but we should get an answer later this year. I think in the near term, this will probably put a chill on larger deals, those that are over 15 billion in size. On the other hand, that might actually accelerate deals for smaller companies, those that are, let's say, less than 10 billion in size. I think those are more likely to go through. And then once we get resolution here, if it goes favorably for the industry, we would see another pickup. And the other factor, I think, driving higher desire for deals, on the other hand, not just the buyers, but on the seller side, one, you have that acceleration of innovation that I mentioned earlier. But you also have a lot of companies that have struggled, the smaller companies that are having a more difficult time accessing capital. And so when it's more expensive to finance yourself, then we often see more deals happen. And last year we saw a number of deals, many of which happen at 100% premium or more, which is actually quite common in this industry. So we do expect more deals. In the short term, we think we'll have a little bit of hesitation for larger deals until we get clarity on how this current case is resolved.
Okay, that's really helpful. Well, Denny, Greg, Andy, thank you so much for all of your insights today. Thank you, everyone, for joining. As you know, all of our investment professionals are always happy to share insights and share what they're seeing within their sectors. So hopefully this was a helpful session. Thank you to everybody.